Welcome to the Eat, Train, Prosper podcast, where we provide you sustainable training principles for strength and building muscle, effective nutrition practices for improving and maintaining a lean physique, and practical lifestyle habits for becoming a champion of your own health, both inside and out. Hosted by Aaron Straker and Brian Borstein. Today's episode, we are talking about the protein range debate. So whether a high protein diet is going to be a more beneficial approach for you, or whether a higher protein diet is going to be a better approach, and how this is going to relate to your own personal goals in the context. But before we get into all of that, Brian, why don't you tell me about the last couple of days?
Everything's been good, man. I finally, I think, found some clarity with what I want to do with my training over the next few months, and I've gone back and forth in my head. I don't know if y'all could kind of sense some of the tone in my voice when I was talking about how demanding and time consuming training has been recently, but it really has. And one interesting thing is that I moved from about 6 to 9 months of really dedicated hardcore hypertrophy focused training into this 6-month period with my coach. So I've been over a year now of just grinding, and I had like a week off here when I moved, and a week of traveling, and things where I was able to get some kind of longer term recovery in there. But for the most part, for the better part of a year and change, I've just been crushing it. And I decided after much consideration that I was going to take back over my own programming into the terms of a 3 times a week full body routine. So I wrote this up, a tentative version, kind of proposed model. And I asked my coach how he would feel about us continuing our relationship with weekly check-ins that aren't necessarily just specific to programming, since he won't really be doing that for me anymore, but more as a way for us to continue a higher level discussion on all things hypertrophy relating to training and nutrition. And he agreed. We came up with a cool setup there, and I'm just really excited to kind of have my programming back in my hands, B, put it into more reasonable frequency. So this 3 times a week thing, I'm actually going to have 6 sessions in the week, and my plan is to do an AM and a PM on the 3 training days. So I'll go lower in the AM, upper in the PM, and be able to kind of auto-regulate some of my training in that regard, where I'll have 1 or 2 movements in each session that I really want to focus on as kind of my metric movements. And then I have arms and delts as desired. So, big compound movements for chest and back, and then arms and delts as desired. And kind of same thing for legs. I'll have 1 or 2 main focused movements and then kind of auto-regulate volume from there. So I'm pretty excited for this. It'll be a change, and as usual, keep everyone updated on that. And then Aaron, I know you have had year-long goals that are culminating here, and I would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, so on last Tuesday, I wrapped up my year of only taking cold showers, which was a very interesting deep dive into like mental fortitude and just dealing with the suck at different parts of the year, especially for those, like 7 weeks we spent in Denver in October and November. And then this Friday, I will also wrap up a year without alcohol, which, to be completely honest, the alcohol was pretty easy for me. Once partying kind of stopped, my use for alcohol in my life kind of really dropped off. But the showers was very trying at different parts. And what's really interesting now is, so I've had 2 showers that weren't cold since last Tuesday. And the first one, the first day, I'm like, man, this feels like great, but then by the time I got out, I felt just like kind of like soft and weak because I had done it. I'm like, because I felt like the cold showers were like this accomplishment, you know what I mean? I felt like accomplished when I got out, and now that I'm not doing them all the time anymore, it was just kind of like a little bit of a letdown. So I came up with some rules with myself. So now, because it is something I want to like, kind of if you don't use it, you lose it, right? I don't want to just like, cold turkey quit. If the sun's out, I'm taking a cold shower. If it's not, I'll take a hot shower, right? And it's just kind of nice knowing that I don't have to, but it's definitely been an interesting year of just the challenge in that regard, for sure.
I can definitely say that being in Colorado in the winter, a hot shower is of paramount value. Um, but I can see that it's interesting, that you decided to, or that your year ended and you're in a warm climate, because I feel like the reward of taking the hot shower would be so much larger if you were still in Colorado.
Yeah, like I don't want to take a hot shower during the day because then I know I'm just going to be like sweating and
Right.
stuff when I get out. And that's been one of the nice parts about it is like I don't have to worry about sweating when I get out of the shower or like when I'm getting dressed. That being said, the weeks in Colorado, especially when like we got those couple snowstorms and it would be like 18 degrees and snowing outside, and I'm like, all right, I'm getting in the shower, But like it's really crazy how the body adapts. I would never, like my teeth were never chattering. My hands and feet would go numb like regularly. But within like 45, 60 seconds of being out of the shower, I was back to a normal temperature. It's really, really wild how you do adapt. And then what was really cool is when I was in Denver, like I was warm all the time. I would still wear shorts to walk to the gym and stuff, even though it would be like 15, 20 degrees outside. And I was really okay with that. So it was really, really interesting how the body does adapt. It was very interesting for sure.
That's super baller, man. I cannot believe that you were going to the gym in shorts in like 30-degree weather. I still like a year and a half being away from SoCal, and I'm still like the biggest pansy when it comes to the weather here.
All right. What do you think about getting into this protein topic?
Yeah, for sure. So, um, it seems like there's ranges. We have kind of literature and preferences of people that it seems to range from somewhere around zero point 0.8 grams per pound of body weight all the way up to like 1.4 and maybe even higher, as we'll discuss. What are some of the factors or variables and specific goals that people might face that would impact their needs? And does preference play a part in that, maybe in adherence?
Yeah. So with the clients that I work with, I generally like, depending on if I have like, let's say we have zero restriction, right? No one has any type of like eating preference or anything like that. Somewhere around the like pound to like 1.25 grams, I really like per body weight. Now that's obviously kind of like a generalization. There are times where we go higher, there are times when we go lower, but I think that's like a decent kind of starting range. The considerations we really like to make are like, what is your end goal? Are you trying to maximize hypertrophy in like the context of what you're eating for, knowing that it's going to be a little bit more time consuming? You're going to have to come up with like more prepped food sources. It might be a little bit higher in cost. Do you have any real concern for body fat accumulation? That's another really important consideration to make, because as protein comes, down, so let's back up a little bit, right? So let's say our end goal is maximizing hypertrophy. It's going to require you to put on some degree of weight, right, to increase the amount of muscle you have. You get to a point where you can split those calories, obviously, between carbohydrate, fat, protein. Do you have a concern about fat accumulation? If you don't, and you're like, hey, I'm gladly willing to put on any fat I need to maximize that hypertrophy, probably spending those calories towards carbohydrate are going to be, the most effective. But then is growing like leaner a priority for you? So personally, I find myself in the latter. I've been through the like, get big at all costs method. And what I found, and what's really interesting is a lot of the research supports this as well. You just put more fat on that you then need to lose when time comes to like lean out. So I take like a little bit of a slower approach, right? Pay a little bit more attention to my blood glucose levels and opt for a little bit of a higher protein intake. Now, why is the higher protein intake going to be, arguably more beneficial? We'll get into that a little bit later in today's episode. Is maintenance another goal of yours? Like, let's say you don't really have any like direct hypertrophy goals, kind of like what you said, a few minutes ago with transitioning your training. Like you've been pushing so hard for, 12 months straight. Basically, you're like, what, I kind of just need a little bit of maybe a physical, mental reprieve where I still want to train, but I don't want to be like really, pushing myself trying to beat the logbook because of the drain that does put on you psychologically, mentally after, 12 months. So if maintenance is your goal and you're just trying to stay there, you can be a little bit like more lenient. It makes your diet, quote unquote, easier on your life, because let's face it, it's much easier to eat fats and carbohydrate than protein. You can find them in much more in abundance from like the shelves in the grocery store, rice cakes, fruits, different things like that don't require like cooking, and it's more cost effective. moving to like the other part of the calorie equation, are you in a calorie deficit? That's another really large consideration. So when you're in a calorie deficit, keeping as much muscle as possible is basically the goal. So you can basically look the best as you drop that body fat, and keeping your protein higher is going to help with that, because one, it's going to be protein sparing, obviously. It's going to help with your satiation, because protein is going to be more satiating than the obviously carbohydrate and fat. And the good way to think about that at the end of the night is when people are like, oh, I'm starving, I'm hungry because I'm at the end, I'm in a diet phase. And sometimes, like, this isn't something I usually use with clients who are like, oh, we'll just eat more chicken breasts. And they're like, oh, I don't want chicken breasts. I'm like, you're not hungry. You just want something want something to do, right? So that's something to think about. It's just more satiating in that regard. And then the kind of the biggest proponent of it with the satiating is it's the thermic effect of feeding, right? So each macronutrient has a thermic effect, approximate, percentage of the work, to quote, your body has to do to digest and assimilate those nutrients, right? Protein is significantly higher. So protein is about 25%. So if you think about it, if you have, 100 calories of protein, 25 of those 100 calories you are going to basically spend in just the digestion and assimilation processes. When compared to carbohydrate and fat, those are much lower. Fat's only usually around like 5 to 7%, and then carbohydrate can be in like the 10 to 15 on the higher ends. So when you consider that, it's just a better choice, I guess. So up to a certain range, you will hit a threshold of diminishing returns, but it's going to be better to eat, a higher protein range of like maybe 1.25, 1.35 up to 1.5, maybe even depending on the coach or their methods and your other kind of health factors that might play into that, as opposed to only eating 0.8, because you need to spend those calories, need to go somewhere. Protein's going to help keep you a little bit more satiated, and you will in turn, metabolize those parts of that energy in those digestion and assimilation processes. The last thing I want to talk about in the calorie deficit part of that is your blood glucose levels. So there is a process of, gluconeogenesis, which is when your body will convert non-glucose-like substances, which can be generally protein. I'm sure within some certain context it could happen as fat also, into like a glucose, but it's uncommon. And it's even if it does happen, it's still an energy conversion process, which is still going to be calories burned, which is, fits within the context of your goal, as opposed to spending those same calories or macros on carbohydrate, which is already a glucose. So, and a consideration there, it's a little bit safer. The safer I'm using in terms of relative to hoping that your body's going to oxidize and mobilize, free fatty acids opposed to glucose. So going with a higher protein is going to lead to that a little bit as well. So that is kind of just like a little high level on that for how protein can fit in based on what your end goal is. What do you have as terms of thoughts about any of that, Brian?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think that what you said kind of aligns with the way that I naturally go through my cutting and gaining periods, in that when I'm cutting, my calorie supply is lower and I want to feel more full, right? So for the satiating effects, I do tend to lean heavier on protein and vegetables, which is kind of irrelevant to protein, but just filling things in general, right? And then when you're gaining, you don't want to feel satiated. At least, I mean, someone in your case, for sure, with someone who has to eat 4,000 calories, you don't want to be overloading on protein, because it's going to be very difficult for you to then get enough calories in overall. One interesting thought that I have on this, that's always, I feel like people have different ways of calculating this, but protein in carbohydrate sources, right? So when you're in a calorie deficit, you're probably not eating a ton of carbs. It's not a huge impact. You're probably going to make sure you're getting enough protein anyways, because you want to preserve muscle. But when you're on a bulking diet and you're eating in a caloric surplus, there's so many carbohydrates being shuttled into your body that you could probably get 50 to 80 grams of protein from carbohydrate sources. Do you count these in your total? Do you take a percentage of them? What's the way that you handle these types of proteins?
Really interesting question. So with myself, my clients, I'm big in the camp of providing you the actual information and education. So I know based on, the coach or the different system that you come through, you don't count protein from carbohydrates, or you don't count like carbohydrates that are in a protein source or something like that. That's not a method that I recommend going with, because I want everyone to learn the actual science, because that's how you can like basically guarantee your results, right? So yeah, if there's protein in your, like let's say you're doing a lot of beans, lentils, or something like that, carbohydrates higher in protein, yeah, of course we're going to count that.
How about like someone who just eats a ton of bagels, and like cereals can have high protein too, right? So it's, I feel like that's even a lower quality protein than what you're going to get in like beans and legumes and stuff like that.
Yeah. So with my clients, what we're generally going to follow guidelines of like 80 to 85 to 90% whole quality nutrient dense food sources. And then we have like 10 to 15% of, flexible foods that I like to call them. So if you're doing like a shit ton of cereal, right, you're not within those guidelines, and you're probably not going to have the best results. And that's like a big part to kind of look back on, like where's your food quality coming from, because it's not just like, too often I think people just sit at the very highest level thinking only about like calories and macros, right? But once you like kind of take it a step down and look at like what are the other what's the ingredient list of the other ingredients that are in that food that you're putting in your body. So when you're eating much more food, like in a bulking or a gaining phase, you're putting, if you're doing a lot of like, all sorts of different bagels or different breakfast cereals and things like that, you're putting more ingredients into your body, and there's just like the higher potential incidence for like low grade inflammation or kind of intolerances to some of those ingredients. So when you're eating just like a very massive wide array of a lot of processed foods, you're just increasing the incidence rate that you have some sort of like negative intestinal reaction or digestive issues that will then, one, your weight will go up, and you won't be able to say if it's tell easily if it's from, the gaining is actually working, or if you're just like masking inflammation and water retention because are eating shit tons of Captain Crunch and don't realize that one of the binding agents or one of the emulsifiers or something like that, you have like a low grade intolerance to. So I think that's how I use that food quality kind of percentage, so that, obviously when we're eating more, we want to incorporate some certain things, like maybe some fruit juices, like orange juice, around a workout or something like that, just to get you easier carbohydrate in, so you're not super, bloated and full all the time. But it's definitely a fine line that you can kind of start to slip down if you let things get a little too loose.
Interesting. Yeah, I tend to definitely lean more on bread products when I'm in a gaining phase. I put buns on all my burgers, and I eat bagels post workout. We'll have cereals for dessert and like things like that. So as a means of getting carbohydrates, I've always wondered about that, because I can look at my nutrition log at the end of the day and it says I had 200 grams of protein, but like 140 of that was from, whey and lean protein sources, and then I've got 60 as like superfluous carbohydrate or protein and carbohydrate sources.
Yeah, and I don't think like in that case it's an issue. I think what it really comes down to, like, are you trying to cheat the system, right? Are you like, well, I don't want to have to eat like cook anything. I'm just gonna have nothing but protein shakes and like, Kodiak cakes. When you're trying to cheat the system, generally you find yourself I don't want to call it victim, but like the things that happen to you when you try and break the rules, like the rules are in a place for a reason, and you can like bend them within, various degrees for certain times. But if you're trying to just get around it by just crushing protein shakes and like protein bagels and muffins and keto muffins and like all these different things, generally will eventually catch up to you.
Yeah, I'm just going with straight normal double baked carb bagels, no protein bagels for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
But shifting gears just a little bit. So we have this need for protein. We all know that protein is important. You need it for training, you need it for recovery, et cetera, et cetera. So we do have specific groups of people, people that have food sensitivities, religious constraints, vegetarianism, veganism, things like this. Can you talk a little bit about some of these protein sources and what these people can do to make sure they're getting enough?
Yeah, so to kind of back up just a little bit, so coming back to the range, right? Which range of protein is going to be, best for you? So there's like the generally like your RDI, which is at like, zero point 0.8 grams per pound, or like up to like a higher intake, like I mentioned earlier in the episode, like 1.25, 1.35, or even higher. There are like some limitations. So either dietary limitations or like moral or religious limitations that can make that more realistic, that you end up on the lower side. So some of these are like food sensitivities, right? So I was talking to a lady, I remember a couple months back, and her, I don't remember if it was her son or her daughter, was allergic to beef. So anytime he had any red meat, he had like, I don't remember which type of reaction. But for someone like that, like, okay, that's just something like you're removing an entire, not necessarily a food group, but a type of a big protein source, right? Especially with like heme iron or different types like that. So with that, it's like a very big consideration to kind of make, and that is going to influence whether you're having like a higher protein or a lower protein intake. So moving forward, kind of like in terms of, in continuation with that, moral standpoints, right? So maybe you have like maybe you're a vegetarian, maybe you're a vegan. Those just kind of limit the options that you have for being able to eat different types of food in that regard, or different protein sources, I should say. So if you do find yourself in one of those kind of groups, you're just kind of limited with the amount of foods you can eat, especially because for some of like your vegan or vegetarian options, your protein increases at a like a factor of your carbohydrate or fat. For example, like a tofu, right? You can get another 20 grams of maybe protein from tofu, but you're also getting like 10 grams of fat or something like that. And in that rate, it's going to be harder to, because you can't, your fat and your carbohydrate are going to have a ceiling at some point based on the context of your goals. So if you get an extra 7 grams of protein, but you had to have an extra 30 grams of carbohydrate to get that 7 grams of protein, you kind of reach like a point of, is it worth increasing my carbohydrate at a rate just to increase my protein? So kind of moving forward from that with the confines of those different macronutrients, the vegan, vegetarianism, like I just kind of talked about. And then if we move into, I guess one thing I do want to say in that, just to help you out. So the exception kind of there is seitan or seitan. I don't know how people say it, in the best way. The exception is what I've found there. That one is you're going to get more protein than like carbohydrate or fat. However, it's wheat gluten, and eating very large amounts of this wheat gluten could become problematic if you have some maybe low-grade gluten intolerance or digestive issues, which are becoming more increasingly common. So that is something to kind of consider with your type of intake, or what, kind of religious, moral, or, dietary limitations you have that would influence it. So in terms of, some of these, opting for that lower intake will be the best case scenario, because it can become semi unrealistic in actually achieving those higher end ranges.
Yeah, so that's all really interesting. I wanted to point out too that I feel like whey products and just in general dairy products are probably like a huge value add for anyone that isn't a vegan and can tolerate those types of proteins.
Yeah, so like a whey isolate, or even if you do digest it well, like a whey concentrate is going to it's just such a low hanging fruit to add a considerable amount of protein into your day. And then if you do digest like dairy well, and you can do like cottage cheese, which is like super high in protein, Greek yogurt is another good option there that really just helps you get it in, or even different like types of cheeses, if you do digest them when you have like the fat macros available. They're just really like simple add-ons that will help you out. If you're not, so if you are like a vegan or a vegetarian, your pea protein isolate is going to arguably be the best source there for a quality protein option that's still like decently high in some of the amino acid profiles, and will get you like a decent chunk of protein without having to like sacrifice the amount of carbohydrate and fats that you get just to achieve that. The one caveat I will make there is it is quite chalky, the pea protein isolate, but If you are interested in trying to find somewhere that does a good one, I know truenutrition.com has a pretty decent pea protein isolate that I have actually tasted in the past. It's pretty decent.
All right, good stuff. Well, definitely lots of egg whites and things like that if you're a vegetarian, and if you're a vegan, you got to figure out those other ways.
Yeah, it's a little bit, you have to step through a few more hoops to get to the end goal, but it's definitely doable. So next we have what's really, really interesting. And I remember you and I had this conversation, I'm trying to think, maybe like super early summertime or end of spring or something. And basically what it is there's two studies we're going to reference that were done semi-recently, within at least the past few years, I believe. And they show protein overfeeding studies. So they took subjects and then fed them in hypercaloric states, but that the majority of that hypercaloric intake came from protein sources. And the findings from these are actually very, very interesting.
Yeah, totally. The first overfeeding protein study, they're both from Jose Antonio's lab with his colleagues. So they took resistance trained people. This is actually one of the coolest parts of the study, is that they did it on people that have been training with weights. So they took one group and they basically kept them at what would be the lower end of the acceptable protein range. So as Aaron discussed earlier, 0.8 grams per pound of body weight is kind of the lower end where you would want to be. That would be a 200-pound male is eating 160 grams of protein. Then they took another group and they put them at double that amount of protein. So actually more than double. They put them at 2 times body weight. So a 200-pound person would be eating 400 grams. And then in the control group, they were eating 160 grams. So that's a ton of extra protein. One of the craziest findings, or the craziest finding of this first study that they did, was that there was no significant changes between both groups in body weight, fat mass, fat-free mass, or percent of body fat. If you're like me, you're sitting here thinking right now, like, okay, these people ate an additional potentially 220 grams of protein per day. That's 880 calories per day that they're eating over this other group. And over a long period of time, literally nothing happened. Essentially what they wanted to do a follow-up study because they needed to kind of suss this out and figure out exactly what is going on with this whole thing. So they did a second study, and in this group, in this time, they had them eating slightly less protein. So one group was right at about body weight. It was 2.3 grams per kilogram, and there's 2.2 kilograms per pound. So just over body weight for one group, and the other group was 3.4 kilograms per day, which is like 1.5 times body weight. So still, high protein levels. Again, resistance trained people. They called them normal protein and high protein groups. And they basically found another crazy finding that the normal protein group gained more body weight than the high protein group, but the high protein group experienced a decrease in fat mass percentage. What is going on with this, right? Additionally, there were no changes in blood parameters. So all basic metabolic panel numbers were the same despite this change to the diet with all this excess protein. Kind of crazy to think that you can eat all this extra protein and actually lose body fat. So what are we to make of this, Aaron?
Yeah, so I have a few of my own hypotheses here. So let's talk about the first one first. So basically what they did is they took these two groups, right, and they just fed them like shitloads of protein. I mean, depending on who you are and coming from, that second group, 2 times body weight, that's like your old school bodybuilder type, for a 200-pound person, 400 grams of protein, which is insane. I think like the most I've ever done was like 305 grams per pound when I was still like 215, 220, and I was miserable. Like that last meal, I was very, very over it. And it was like a commitment, like, all right, Aaron, we signed up for this. We're going to do it, but I really didn't want it. So if you remember kind of back earlier in the episode, I talked about thermic effect of feeding, right? And proteins is just significantly higher. So for protein, especially like lean, animal cuts of protein or something that you actually have to like chew, digest, it's like comes in a whole, you're going to expend, about 25% of that to digest and assimilate those nutrients. So that's a big proponent, or a big a part of this. And then for protein to actually get converted and stored as body fat, it's a very, very energy intensive process. So first you're going to have protein, right? Your body's going to take what it needs from, bring that down to amino acids, put that into amino acid pool. And then if it's truly an excess, right? And let's assume that carbohydrates are lower and you're not, getting enough of your carbohydrate. Your body's going to go through that process of gluconeogenesis to convert that protein into a glucose, carbohydrate. Carbohydrate is really interesting in that we can store it, right? We can store it that's not body fat. We can store carbohydrate primarily in our muscles and in our liver, and actually our brain will store a little bit too in a compound called glycogen, which think of it as like potential energy, right? Energy stores. For then, even if say those are completely maxed out, and then we decide, hey, this what was originally protein is now a glucose that we want to convert and actually store as body fat, we need to go through a process called de novo lipogenesis to convert that to what would be, your free fatty acids to actually store in our adipose tissue. So it's just like very energy intensive processes that have to go through these conversions where these large chunks of what was that initial protein and the calories from that are getting chopped off in these like conversions. So a little kind of scenario I like to use here is like, let's say you're traveling and you have $100 of like US American dollars and you go to like Europe and you convert that to euro, I guess. And the person that does that conversion for you is going to take their cut, let's say 15%. So you started with $100 and now you have an equivalent of $85 in your, euro. And then maybe you travel to somewhere like UK or Britain or something like that, and you need to pay for something in like a local currency. Let's just for example's sake, they don't take the euro. You need to convert it to like the British pound. Whoever converts that's going to take their 15%. So now you have, I should have used an easier number, but whatever 15% of 85 was. So like, let's say it's, 60, just to make it really, really simple. So you started with $100, now you have 60, and it's because whoever does that process, like takes their cut. And that is how you can have, what started as so much protein in terms of like this caloric excess, but they find that you don't actually store any, there was no, tangible or even measurable increases in fat mass because it's such an energy intensive process to keep doing these conversions. So that is like kind of my hypothesis on the first study. And then the second one, again, it all comes down to this is where when people, coming back to what I said briefly earlier about your levels of the importance of the different nutrition parts. At the very, very top, we have the calories, right? And then there's your crowd that says like calories are the only thing that matters. Like how you have your protein, your carbohydrates, and your fats don't matter. It's not really true. The second level is like that protein or that macronutrient distribution. If you were to take someone, two people, I guess, or even in a study like this, and feed them an isocaloric calorie content, right? So same calories, one person's is like much higher in protein. Let's say the other person's are made up of fat in a hypercaloric, state, which, exceeding maintenance, like in this, particular use case with the study, that person who has a higher protein is not going to put on as much, body fat as that person eating the increase in fat mass. So what's interesting here is with this second study, these findings are in alignment with a lot of the other overfeeding studies that I have found and looked at and read on particularly like carbohydrate versus fat. But this one is what's cool is the first one with protein, which, again, points to that just if you want to eat a lot and not have to worry about, your fat increasing to like a particular marginal an appreciable manner, going with the protein is going to be a better approach. And in this case, you can even decrease some of your fat mass as well, just through that expensive energy conversion process.
Yeah, I think practically the takeaway for people, or at least kind of what I would take away from it, is that if I'm in a cutting phase and I find myself extremely hungry and I'm like, I literally don't know what to do, I feel like I'm going to just waste away and die, reaching for a chicken breast is probably a pretty safe move. And even if I went a little overboard and had 200 or 300 calories of chicken breast, which is like, 50 to 75 grams of protein, it probably isn't going to have much of a negative impact, but it's probably going to really fill me up. And I think that is definitely, something that builds confidence if you're dieting, to realize that you don't have to necessarily go hungry. You just have to make specific choices that allow you to fulfill that hunger.
Yeah.
And then kind of, one other thing that this study brought attention to was no changes in blood parameters. So, I mean, I think for the most part, the whole kidney safety and high protein diet intake thing has been mostly put to rest, but, we'd also think the same about knees over toes in squats, and people still have questions about that. So let's talk a little bit about high protein intakes and kidneys here.
Yeah, so again, it's a really good thing you brought that up, because what's nice with that marker is they said there's been no changes in blood parameters from their basic metabolic panel that they ran. Though, and from the studies that have been most recently done, they pretty much consistently find that a couple things with high protein intakes is your GFR, which is a filtration rate marker for how much blood is passing through your kidneys, will increase. But as long as you don't have existing, either chronic kidney disease or your existing renal function and it's perfectly healthy, that increase is a non-concern. The caveat that I definitely do want to point out is if you do have existing renal, a poor, diminished, decreased capacity of that renal function, or you have chronic kidney issues, high protein diets can potentially exacerbate these. So that is like kind of the big caveat there. And related to other kind of elevated enzymes and blood work, from when I do my own blood work or when I look at clients' blood work or something like that, the majority, like 9 times out of 10, if you have increased either like kidney or liver enzymes, which people obviously are perfectly fine being concerned about, it's generally from training the day before. So because especially if you train like legs or something like that and you're a little bit dehydrated, you're going to have some of those markers of protein breakdown in your bloodstream because you just trained legs the day before you got your blood drawn. So anytime you do that, just kind of take a step back and see, okay, what did I do the day before? Did I train legs or something like that before I went and got my blood work done? And that's generally going to be the case, I find, for a lot of people, because it's not known that, hey, you should probably take a day or two off from training before you get your blood work done.
It's kind of like the creatinine, how if you take creatine, your creatinine is always going to show up like ridiculously high, and the doctor is going to be like, what is wrong with this person?
Yeah, just one of those, like your BUN and your creatinine are generally, if you're like someone who's lifting weights, heavy training regularly, like mine are almost always like slightly out of range. But I'm never concerned because I know that.
Very cool. Well, I think that overall we got some good points out there. I'm glad we got to touch on the overfeeding protein studies, and hopefully we got some good information out there for people to practically apply these protein numbers into their own lives and get the most benefit from it.
Yeah, so just to kind of wrap things up and, kind of give you guys a summary of everything. Generally, a higher protein intake, as long as you don't have any kind of, moral, religious, or dietary restrictions, is going to give you more flexibility in terms of what you can do and stay leaner, especially when it comes to dieting. If your goal is to really just stay where you're at, maintenance, and you want to make your dieting easier on you, you can, bring your protein down to push some of those calories to carbohydrate or fat based on your dietary preferences. In terms of bulking, you definitely want to kind of hit a ceiling with your protein intake because it's cost effective, and eventually you just need more energy to basically power those processes, which is going to be easier from carbohydrate intake. But really, really cool episode. I'm glad we got to dig into those studies and really just kind of lay this out for everyone. So if anyone has any kind of remaining questions about any of this, on Instagram, ping me, ping Bryan. We'll help you guys out. But until next time, talk to you later.
Later.
Thank you so much for listening to Eat, Train, Prosper. If you found this episode valuable, please subscribe or share us with your friends. You can find more from Aaron at strakernutritionco.com and more from Bryan at evolvedtrainingsystems.com. Talk to you guys next time.